Good morning. My name is Ruth Shepherdson, and this is today's lecture about the respiratory system in animal science. At the end of this lesson, I would actually encourage you to go back and watch the YouTube video that I have listed here on the first slide. Um, I will put it on Google Classroom so that you can get to it. It gives a very nice overview of the respiratory system and how all systems work together. To give you the background and something to connect to, we've gone through most of the systems of animals at this point, and we spent our last week primarily talking about the inner workings of the endocrine and circulatory systems. The circulatory system being one of the most important in life because it delivers oxygen all over the body and and takes away deoxygenated blood. So that oxygen gets into the blood through the respiratory system. And that gives us our next topic. The entire purpose of the respiratory system is to provide oxygen to the tissues and take carbon dioxide from the body. Too much carbon dioxide in our body actually poisons us, so it's important to get rid of the excess. The respiratory system also aids in temperature control, elimination of waste, as in toxins that come into our body, and voice production. We need to clean our air before it enters the internal workings of our body as human beings, as do all animals. And so the respiratory system helps us do that. Here's a picture of both a lamb and a chicken, and you can kind of see where the respiratory system always in every animal sits in the very center of the body. Biologically, animals have their most important organs closest to the middle. It's a rule of thumb that aids in survival. And so, if you study survival of the fittest, you know that in order for a species to survive, they have to be able to live and they have to be able to reproduce. And so, we especially see those two systems being very close to the middle of the body for production purposes. If we connect this to the skeletal system that we studied earlier in the semester, we know that our ribs protect our lungs in almost every animal and aids them from getting punctured. This is a human respiratory system. In part, I want you to take a look on the right-hand side as we see that list of parts. Those are the parts we're going to take notes on today. No need to write them down now, but as we go through them, if I'm going too fast, feel free to stop and pause and write down anything you need to help you remember these parts and pieces. We'll start with the nostrils. The nostrils are the external opening in the respiratory system. It's how air first enters the body. The air then goes into the nasal cavity, and your nasal cavity is connected to your mouth. You have both a hard and a soft palate, and there's a couple of things that happen at this point. Mostly, your body or any animal's body wants to keep solid and liquid items from getting into the lungs. And so a lot of things can be sorted out through the nasal cavity. And then the air goes down the pharynx. Now, you've studied the larynx before. The larynx is how we make noise out of our throats. The pharynx is that common passageway that both food and air go down, but they're not supposed to go down at the same time. And so we have one of my favorite words in science, the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a valve-like structure, and it shuts off when you're swallowing food so that the foods go into your digestive system, not your lungs. And then it opens back up when air needs to go back in your valves. This is kind of a cool thing to think about if you've ever had little kids will take a bite of something that's too big and it'll feel like it gets stuck in their throat until they get a drink of water to wash it down. Well, it's the epiglottis that keeps that from going down into their lungs. Occasionally this doesn't work, and that's choking, right? So if your epiglottis does not keep the solid things out, something can go down into your lungs and it becomes a medical emergency. This can also happen in farm animals. And so in both cases, typically when someone chokes, until the airway is blocked, they're actually okay-ish. For example, there might be a small chunk of carrot there, but air can still get by it. And so the human body keeps operating. Or one time I had a lamb and something got stuck in the throat, and they literally just coughed the entire day. Well, the body coughs to get things out, and so finally the piece of whatever it was came out, and the lamb was fine. Also considered part of the respiratory system is the larynx that I mentioned previously. Some people also call this the voice box. This controls the breathing and continues to keep objects out of the lungs. There have been different trends throughout time where if a dog has a barking problem, they actually have been known to debark a dog, and that requires taking the larynx out. So they make the barking sound, they open their mouth, the air goes back or past, but there's no noise that comes out. That is not a very popular procedure anymore. It's kind of determined to be non-necessary because in most cases training can take care of issues like that. It's just an owner that maybe needs to explore different options. Next, we go into the trachea, and if we go back to this picture of our human respiratory system, you can kind of see the structure of the trachea. I think of it like the hose on a vacuum. And so it's consistent in width, but it also has muscular rings around it. And those muscular rings are what help get food down your trachea, if you will. And so they actually start contracting at the top and contract one after another all the way down to get the food, to get things down into the trachea, um, and later into the respiratory system or not. From here, things are especially specialized for the respiratory system, and we go from bigger to smaller, and from bronchi to bronchioles to alveoli. These are essentially tubes that come off of the trachea. There are tubes that go into either side of the lung, and they start bigger and they branch into smaller and smaller. And so the bronchi are the two main chunks, and they go into either side, and then smaller bronchioles come off of that, and finally alveoli, which are the smallest, and they actually assist a lot with taking the excess carbon dioxide out of the lungs. We mentioned this in class the other day, but the consistency of lungs is kind of hard to understand. They're essentially elastic, spongy material, and they're kind of cone shaped and divided into lobes. And inside that spongy material, a lot of air can be held. So lungs that have, obviously, will also always float in water if they have lungs, if they have air in them. The primary purpose of your lungs is to exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide. Your lungs are very important to the animal's body. Below the lungs are what we call the diaphragm. I apologize for the misspelling of that word. A diaphragm is the sheet of muscles located beneath the lungs, and they are actually what separate your chest cavity from your abdominal cavity. So we don't want those two systems of digestion and respiratory to be together, or in some cases, the abdominal cavity is primarily then meant for your circulatory system. Animals have all sorts of respiratory problems. We'll start with a few of them that are problematic for humans. They're only the first two, cigarettes and vaping, are not problematic for animals because they don't get to make that choice as to whether or not to smoke or vape. But pneumonia is actually the main respiratory problem in both humans and animals, and you're going to do a substantial amount of research on that today, because in the beef industry, bovine respiratory disease is actually the most money costing problem in North America. So it's something that we vaccinate for. That bovine respiratory disease can lead then to pneumonia. So we'll look at a picture of what that looks like. But first, a couple things to hopefully scare you into living a healthy life. The first is that when you smoke, the things in a cigarette enter your lungs. So on the screen in front of you, there's a picture of a healthy set of lungs on the right. If you've ever harvested an animal, you'll notice that the color of lungs is similar in humans and in, say, elk and deer, beef, other animals like that. You'll see that lobe cone shape of lungs. And I hope you'll notice that in a pair of lungs where someone has smoked, there's really a couple issues. One is that they're smaller and less effective. That's why people who have smoked for a long time often have times actually getting the oxygen into their bloodstream, because the lungs become filled with tar and other chemicals that exist in cigarettes. So essentially, you don't want anything but air in your lungs. Even if that's fluid, it is very problematic to your breathing. Cigarettes actually are used less and less all the time. But one of the habits that has replaced that is actually vaping. And I'm sure you've heard my rants before on how vaping is in some ways even more dangerous because teenagers get away with it without the smells associated with smoking. But essentially, this is kind of what happens in your airways when you are vaping. And you may have already seen these pictures. On the left, we see the airways of a non-smoker. You can see that they're opened. Airways are actually very elastic, so they get bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller. When you smoke, the problem is foreign objects and chemicals getting in the way of those airways. So you can kind of see that there's some gunk growing in there. There's some pus and things like that. But finally, on the right, the vaping one is a little bit different. While there isn't those same foreign items in there, it's hard to tell from the picture, but the airways harden in one shape. And so when you are exercising, your airways actually expand and get bigger so you can get more oxygen to your muscles. And then at rest, they actually get smaller. And vaping begins to harden those surfaces so that they can no longer get bigger. They stay in usually that small position. So those are some of the risks associated. In humans and animals, we also struggle in the respiratory system with pneumonia. And so, to give you an idea of what goes on in an animal's body when they have pneumonia, it basically is an accumulation of fluid and pus, to be honest, in the lung. And so you can see that lung on the right has both some inflammation, and then inside the alveoli, there's a lot of fluid filling it up. Well, when fluid is filling that up, it's not properly doing air exchange. And so that's why somebody who has pneumonia feels like they just can't get any air. Even though they are breathing, the air exchange isn't actually happening. So when bronchioles and alveoles have that capacity diminished because of the pus and the fluid, that's pretty problematic. Usually it's not usually, sometimes it's a bacterial infection that's causing that pus. Sometimes it's viral. How the doctor treats pneumonia is dependent on that source. In animals, our best thing to do is actually prevent pneumonia, prevent bovine respiratory disease so that it doesn't grow into pneumonia. Pneumonia is significantly more difficult to treat in animals than humans because they typically are living outside and the temperature of the air factors in, and the dosing of the antibiotics and things like that gets a little tricky. But that leads me to your task today. Your task is actually to do a little bit of reading on your own. And you're going to write a half-page summary and turn in on Google Classroom to tell me what bovine respiratory disease is. You should include how it travels, what the research shows makes it common in which herds, what treatment and prevention we have for it. And I think you'll be fascinated to know how much money it actually costs producers. We typically vaccinate for this because it has proven to be detrimental to a herd, in part because pneumonia can travel in between animals very quickly. So financially, we're money ahead to vaccinate and prevent rather than respond to bovine respiratory disease. So you should have taken notes on this. You're going to follow up with the YouTube video, and then you're going to do half a page of research and turn in on the respiratory system. Have a good day.